Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again here. Monica's here. Good morning, Monica. Baja's here. Good morning. Jimmy's here. Good morning to you, Jimmy. Mashid. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Tika. Good morning, Jenna. Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Erica. And good morning, Banamere. So, I think that's about 10. Maybe we'll give it a minute or two to see if a few more people trickle in. How's everyone feeling this morning? Tuesday, week 5, believe it or not. What emoji represents your emotional state this morning? Which emoji represents your emotional state? I think I'm going to go with this one. Morning, Karen. I'm going to go with that one. Jenna's, I think that's feeling okay. I think, uh-oh. Karen's lots of straight lines there, Karen. Baja's feeling, I think, I'm not sure if that's intellectual or nerdy. That's Casey. Casey looks pretty happy. Baja looks nerdy. Karen's kind of so-so, I think. I think Jen is doing okay. I'm upside down. Erica looks pretty happy. That's good. Um, Tika looks good. All right. I think overall on average, we're pretty happy, it looks like. All right, so there's 10 of us here. What we'll do today is we're just going to review what we talked about on Monday because it's been or on Friday. We'll review what we talked about on Friday because it's 3 days ago. So we'll do that. We'll talk about the article we read. We'll talk about some statistics, right? But that'll be okay. Don't worry about that. Talk a little bit about some statistics, and then I'm going to set you free to just do a very short kind of assignment that should take you like 5 minutes, and then you can email it to me at the end. Okay, so that's what we'll do today. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, people. So on Monday, if you recall, we were talking about the social construction of race in the United States, right? We said that race was not really a biological thing for humans. We don't really have biological races, but us humans have imagined that race is an important thing anyway. And so because humans believe that race is important, of course it becomes important, right? Because humans socially construct their reality. The things that we believe to be true have power in society, whether they're true or not, right? And so we said that if we looked at the United States, for instance, and of course we're just looking at the story of Black Americans here. There are other minoritized groups within the United States that all have their own story, but we're just kind of focusing on Black Americans. Good morning, Hassan. These people, oh, Banamere, don't cry. So, Black people were brought to the U.S. specifically as slaves, right? They were brought as property to provide cheap labor, and again, this was a bit of an awkward situation once the U.S. became a country because the U.S. was founded on equality and freedom. And of course, the U.S. would go on to systematically deny equality and freedom to these Black people that were brought over. And so Americans, not just Americans, Europeans as well, but Americans turned to science to prove that these races were real and that people of different races were different and actually inferior to them. And we said, of course, there's no truth to that, of course. Race is just not a biological reality for humans. But again, because people believed it to be true, it wound up having very real consequences. And so, as we saw here, it started working its way. Racial categories started working their way into U.S. law very early, right, in the 16th and 1700s. And again, as more and more immigrants started to arrive in the U.S. In the 1800s and the 1900s, the idea of whiteness was used to kind of protect certain legal and to protect certain legal and political rights. And of course, as a result, even though slavery ended in 1865 for the Americans, there were still very strong prejudicial and racist ideas that were based on 100 years or 100 years of kind of racist belief. And so Black people in the U.S. continued to be discriminated against and marginalized, even though slavery was abolished, right? And so, sorry, I'm going to skip through this quickly because we've kind of read it before. But where I wanted to get to was that even all the way into the present day, even though there are laws that prevent people from being discriminated against based on their race, of course, we know that racism continues to exist. It continues to persist both in the United States and in other countries as well. And that kind of led us to this article. Good morning, Ivan, or good evening, Ivan. This led us to this article that we read here, America's Long Overdue Awakening to Systemic Racism. And so it was a brand new article. It was just published a little bit less than a week ago. And the author made kind of a loose argument about racism in the US and suggested some important things for us to consider. And if you'll remember, I think this is kind of what came out of that article. The author was arguing that centuries of racist policies and laws, which of course we just talked about, both explicit, so the ones that are clearly racist, and implicit, the ones that are not obviously racist but have racist effects, all of those have left Black Americans in the dust. It's left them behind and disadvantaged, physically and emotionally and economically. And so the author pointed the finger at the education system in the US that fails Black Americans. The author pointed the finger at substandard healthcare that makes Black Americans more susceptible to disease and to death. And the author pointed the finger at the economy, right? The fact that there is pretty significant economic inequality in the US, and that many of the people on the bottom part of the economic pyramid are Black Americans, right? And so the author, in order to sort of prove this, the author showed us or mentioned a number of numbers and statistics, right? And they were trying to identify the existence of systemic racism, okay? And so I just want to jump in here at this point and explain something if I haven't explained it already. The idea here is that when you're talking about systemic racism, you're talking about racism in the way that society works, okay? So if you imagine the society that we live in here in Canada or somewhere else, if you imagine that society, it's almost like a machine, okay? And the machine has all kinds of different parts. You and I are tiny little parts in this machine. And every morning that machine starts to operate, right? And the machine of society operates to kind of get everyone the things that they need, right? People go to work to earn money. People go to work to provide goods and services to other people in the community. We are entertained, we are informed by the media. The government sort of tries to keep control of everything. Schools try to educate the next generation. The police and the criminal justice system try to take people who break the law and sort of punish them or give them consequences. All of these things are parts of the machine, and that machine operates kind of all day, every day. And again, we're just little pieces in it. The tricky part about systemic racism is that the idea is that that machine, the way that that machine works, gives advantages to some people and it disadvantages others. And it gives advantage to people based on the social groups they belong to, and in this case, in race. And so the way this machine works, this machine of society works, is that it gives advantage to white people and it disadvantages black people and other peoples of color, right? And again, we should understand that that's not really an accident, because again, dominant groups are usually the ones that design this machine. They're the ones that build the machine. They're the ones that are in control of it. And so, of course, it works in such a way that benefits them, right? That's the idea of systemic racism. And so the problem with that, well, there's lots of problems with that. One of the problems with that is that it becomes very difficult to see how, in some cases, how the systemic racism is working, right? Because the machine is complicated, right? Here in Canada, we have a societal machine of 36 million people. And I know that's not a lot. Lots of other countries are much bigger. We're not a huge country in terms of population, but there's 36 million moving parts to this machine. And it's very complex to sort of understand how it works and to identify certain places where you have a problem, right? And so, good morning, Krish. And so systemic racism isn't about, like we've mentioned this before, systemic racism isn't about single incidents. So it's not about somebody saying or doing something that's racist, even though that's bad. It's not about that. And it can't be solved with one thing either, because it's not just one thing that's wrong, it's lots of things, okay? So how do we know that we have systemic inequality? In this case, racism, but we'll talk about sexism and stuff later. How do we know that we have systemic inequality? How do we know that the system is giving advantage to some and disadvantaging others? Well, we start to look at some of the numbers. We start to look at statistics. And so the author has given us a few numbers here. And the author says that Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely as white women to die in childbirth. That's pretty significant, right? 3 or 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. Black children are more likely to attend under-resourced schools, thanks to reliance on local property taxes. So we talked about that, or the video that you just watched talked about that. Black voters are 4 times as likely as white voters to report difficulties in voting, right? So again, there's a number of different reasons for that, but it makes it more difficult for Black Americans to vote, to have their voices heard in government, right? Millions of Black Americans have been disenfranchised because of felony convictions. So the idea here, and I'm not too familiar with U.S. law, but if you are convicted of a felony, which is a more major crime, you lose your right to vote. And so if you have a lot of Black people who have been convicted of felonies, they're not able to vote. They're not able to use their voice in government anymore, right? So that disadvantages them again. We'll get to that in a second. Hurricane flooding, and so natural disasters seem to impact Black neighborhoods more. Household worth, so how much money you have at the end of the day, how much your net worth is. 17,000 $17,000 for a black household, while white households are worth 10 times that, right? That's a big difference. And again, even right now, the data seems to suggest that black Americans die from COVID-19 much more often than white Americans. So this is one of the things that we're trying to do here. And you might remember this slide from the first or second class when we started talking about this. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is this is what we're doing here. We are trying to let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader social patterns. And so, again, when we're trying to figure out if we have a significant problem with racism, we can't look at single instances, right? Does the death of George Floyd a couple weeks ago, which was, of course, barbaric and awful, does that prove that we have racism? On the other hand, a few years ago, Barack Obama became president of the United States for 8 years. Does that prove we have no racism? No, right? One single thing doesn't prove systemic racism one way or the other. You need data on the larger society. Okay, that's how we can identify it. And so the article of this author has done that. They've tried to show us broader social patterns, not just single experiences or stories of individual people. And again, that doesn't mean that the stories of individual people are not important. It just means that it doesn't prove that we have a systemic problem, and the numbers do. Okay, so before we dig into this, I want to very quickly ask you about the video that we watched. And so in the video, I asked you a question here about which social institutions were involved in systemic racism. So the video mentioned a bunch of different social institutions. Which ones did you see in that video? Oh, okay. So Erica says, yeah, the financial system, right? Banks were implicated in that system because they provide loans to people, right? And loans are a way in which you can build wealth. Sometimes you need money to go to college, you need money to buy a house, sometimes you might need money to buy a car because you need your car for work. Banks are a social institution, they're a financial institution, and they have something to do with systemic racism. Karen says housing. Yeah, there's an entire housing industry that banks are connected to, but also governments are connected to as well, because government set the rules and policies around houses, right? They set the rules for who gets mortgages, what the rules are in terms of qualifying for one or paying for one. Governments are the ones that create housing zones and determine what kind of houses or structures can be built where, right? Those are all government responsibilities. Casey says banks are in there. Yep, insurance companies for sure. They're part of the financial institution, but they're involved as well. Yeah, and they deny black people loans, right? There's more though. Banks are in there. Government is in there. Insurance companies are in there. Who else did they mention? I'll give you a hint. You're doing it right now. You're doing it right now. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, see, yeah, the education system. The education system is part of this too. And so just in that little short video, and I hope I'm not leaving any out, I probably am. remind me if I'm missing something. The financial sector, financial institutions, the government, education, the political system, I guess, is part of that as well. They're all kind of operating and working together. And the end result of that is that, again, black families are disadvantaged, right? And white families are advantaged. Okay. So again, how do we see systemic inequality? How do we see that the system is actually advantaging some people and disadvantaging others? Well, we need data, right? We need numbers. We need to be able to see patterns. So we're going to talk very briefly about statistics, and I mean super briefly, because statistics is actually like a whole science in itself, and it's a science that I don't fully understand. I know a little bit, but a little bit will be okay for us. Just knowing a few things will help us to be able to understand some of the numbers that we see, okay? And so just to give you a definition here, statistics involves collecting and organizing and analyzing data, right? So we collect information, statisticians collect information, and then they try to establish patterns, right? They try to analyze the data in a way that it tells a story about something, or it shows us something that we couldn't have seen in another way, okay? Now, for our purposes here, we're going to talk about three things, okay? We're going to talk a little bit about sample size. We're going to talk a little bit about over and under representation, and we're going to ask the question of what does the data actually tell us, okay? So obviously there's way more to statistics, but this will be enough for us to understand some of the numbers we see. If you already know this already, then you can just sort of roll your eyes at me, but I think it's important for us to go through. Okay, so sample size refers to the number of data points in your data set, okay? So how many records or how many pieces of data do you have, okay? So let's pretend we have our class here, okay? Now there's 19 students in our class, and if I ask you all if you like to eat fish, then the sample size is 19, right? As long as all of you answer me. If I ask all of you, then I've sampled 100% of the population, right? Everyone in the class has been asked the question. And then let's say that 1 in 3 students says yes. I think my math is a little bit weird here because it wouldn't work out that way because you can't divide 3 into 19. But let's just say that 33% of you said yes, okay? So we've established that 33% of the class likes to eat fish, and most of you don't. 66% do not, okay? So that's a very accurate statistic for this class, right? Because we've asked everyone. And so if we say 33% of the class likes to eat fish, then that's actually absolute, right? There's no error or question because we've actually asked everyone. But unfortunately, when you're looking at real statistics and you're looking at real countries, you can't ask everybody, right? If we want to know, let's say in Canada, how many people are in favor of defunding the police, we can't ask all 36 million people, right? It's too much, it's too big, it's too complicated, right? So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to ask a smaller sample, right? We're going to ask a small group of people, and then we're going to assume that this group of people represents all of us, okay? But the problem is that small group that we ask has to be big enough to be representative of all of us, okay? And so the question of do we eat fish in our class is very accurate because we've asked everyone. We've asked 100% of the population, do you like fish? And so our statistic is very accurate, right? But what does it tell us about Columbia College? Can we say, and I'll ask you here, can we say that 33% of Columbia College students like to eat fish? And so I'm asking you there, do you think that the data that we collected in our class is accurate for the entire Columbia College? There's about, just so you know, there's about 2,400 students at the entire college, okay? Do you think, so Erica thinks it is not, why not? KC says no. Why is it not, why is it probably not true for the college as a whole? Why is it probably not true for the college as a whole? I think you're right, by the way, Erica and KC. I think you're, I don't think we can say that 33% of the college likes to eat fish. But why not? Why not? There's two things I can think of. I'm hoping you'll get one. I'm not sure about the other one, but I guess we'll see. And there might be things that I haven't thought of, but I'm curious. So, so we would give the maybe that. Well, that's true, right? You actually, yeah. Let's say that, Karen. When people report something, they're only reporting how they feel at the moment, right? And so they could change their mind later. They could be wrong. Obviously, if I'm asking you if you'd like to eat fish, most people know the answer to that. But there are other questions that people might say yes or no to, but they might actually be wrong. And we'll talk about that in a second. But that's true, right? Is that we can't always trust that people will give an honest answer, and we can't always trust that they will give the right answer or a logical answer. Well, Casey says because you have to survey all the students first. Well, that would be the way to be the most accurate. You're definitely right, Casey. So if I really wanted to know for sure, I would ask every single student. But again, often we can't do that, right? Especially with big countries. Look at the US. The US has 330 million people. If they want to know how Americans feel about defunding the police, there's just no way to ask everyone, right? It's too much. It's too many. You have to do a poll, right? You have to do a smaller sample size to try to figure out how you think everyone is feeling. And so you're making a bit of a guess, right? You're assuming that the smaller group of people that you do ask represents the bigger group, but sometimes you're not sure. Okay. Here's how it works. The smaller your sample is, okay, so the smaller number of people you ask, the less likely it's going to be true for everyone, okay? So again, if we wanted to, like KC says here, if we wanted to know how many people like to eat fish at Columbia College, the perfect way to do it would be to ask every single person. And then we would know for sure, right? We would have 100% of the population. Now, let's say we couldn't do that, but let's say we could ask half of them. So let's say we could ask 1,200 of those students. Do you think that would still be accurate? Do you think that would still be accurate for the whole group? If we asked half of the students, do you like to eat fish? And let's say 20% said yes, okay? So we ask half the students, 20% of them say yes, they like to eat fish. Does that mean that that 20% is probably true for the whole college? What do you think? Yeah, so if we ask half of the students at the college if they like fish, and 20% say, yeah, I like to eat fish, do you think that's a good measure of the whole college? Yes, no, maybe so. I don't get it. What are we talking about? I know all this already. Can't we just have a break already? that's a very safe answer. Maybe. Come on, people. I know there's 15 of you. How many students are in the college? Karen, there's 2,400 students in the college. 2,400 about. So 1,200 is half. That's 50% of our population that we have asked. So do you think that that's, whatever they say might be reasonably accurate of the entire college? Okay, that's good. Because by the end of today, Manish, you're going to be 100%. You're going to be all the way there. Hmm. I think I have a better example for you, but we'll work with this one for a second. It's not true because maybe they chose people to hang out. Okay, so that's very true, right? It would depend on how, this is getting really complicated now, how I collect my sample, right? So I want to make sure that I, don't just ask a single group. I want to make sure that I ask all kinds of different people, right? Okay. Let me ask you, let me try and illustrate this another way, which might make more sense to you. If we were to have a final exam, it's a multiple choice. It's a multiple choice exam. Okay, let's pretend. We're going to pretend here. This is not happening. Final exam, multiple choice. You have a choice of how many questions I will ask you. So do you want me to ask you one question or two or three or four or 10 or 20 or 50? How many questions do you want me to ask you? What do you want me? How many questions do you want? Erica says one question. Okay. You can choose. I can ask you 1, 2, 4, 10, 20, 50, 100, 300. What do you want? Tell me what you want, people. Just one. Oh, interesting. Okay. Karen says 10 because you could fail. Yeah. Candace says 10. 11. Okay. 5 to 10 really, really easy. Oh, well, you don't know if they're easy yet. You don't know if they're easy, Manish. You could hope for that. So this is what I want to bring up here, is that Karen said something important, is because Karen wants more questions, because if there's only one question on the exam and you don't get it right and it's multiple choice, then you fail, right? So the only two marks you could get on the final exam are 0 and 100, right? And the 100 is really attractive, but the 0 is not, right? So let's say Karen, that you're doing that final exam for me, and let's say that you know about 70% of the material, okay? So that's what you should get. But of course, if I only ask you one question, you're either going to get a 0 or 100, and neither of those are very close to what you should actually get. In real life, you should get a 70. So if I ask you 2 questions, then you could get 0%, or you could get 50%, or you could get 100%. And so again, that doesn't really tell me very much about what you know. It might get me a little bit closer, right? 50 is a little closer to 70, maybe, but still, it doesn't give me an accurate measure of what you know. So maybe I ask you 4 questions. And so then you could get 0 or 25% or 50 or 75% or 100, right? And that gets me a little closer to what you actually know. And so the more questions that I ask you, the more accurate your mark is going to be, right? If you should get a 70%, because that's about the amount of stuff that you know, the more questions I ask you, the closer your mark will get to that 70%, right? So if I ask you 10 questions, you'll probably get 7 of them right? You may get one extra one wrong, or you might get one extra one right, but it'll be close. And if I ask you 20 questions, your final grade will be even closer to 70%. And if I ask you 100 questions, it will get even closer to 70%. And so what I'm trying to show you here is that the bigger your sample is, the more accurate it is of the whole, right? And so if I sample your knowledge in this class with one question, it's not going to be very accurate, because you know 70% of stuff and you're either going to get a 0 or 100, and neither of those are really reflective of what you know. So the more questions I ask you, the better my results will actually be. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Please let it make sense. Does that make sense? So the more questions I ask you, the more accurate measure I get of what you actually know. Yeah. So I know why you said one question, because why would you want to do a big long final exam, right? That would be ridiculous to want to do that. But again, the more that you do, the better sense I get, the better measure I get of what you actually know, right? And so, yeah. And so we're not going to do a final exam in this class, but when I do one, I try to create an exam that is just big enough to get me to get a measure of what you know, right? I don't want you to, I could ask you 400 questions, but eventually it doesn't get any more accurate, right? It just gets long. Exactly, good. So the bigger your sample size is, the more it reflects what actual reality is, right? So at the college, for instance, if we ask them about eating fish, then if we only ask one person, they're going to say yes or no. And so the only thing we'll be able to say is that nobody at the college likes fish, or everybody does. And neither of those things are probably true. If we ask 2 people at the college, well, they might both say no, so 0%. They might both say yes, 100%, or one might say yes and one might say no, and 50%. So are either of those accurate? Probably not, right? So we have to ask a big enough group of people so that it is so that it represents the whole so that we get a good measure, even if it's a little bit inaccurate, right? And so back to this analogy here with the test, asking you one question would be a mistake, right? Because you'd either get 0 or 100, and I'm sure that nobody knows 0 or 100%. But if I ask you more questions, I get a better measure. And so 10 questions might not be bad, right? Because if Karen knows 70% of the material and I ask her 10 questions, there's a pretty good chance that she'll get 7 of them right, right? She might get an extra one right, or she might get an extra one wrong. So there's, 10% on either side. But 10 questions might not be that bad. If I ask her 20 questions, it might be better. 30 questions, I would probably start to get a pretty good measure of what she knows. It would probably come closer to 70%. And again, if I ask Karen 100 questions, then I would definitely get close to that 70%, right? She would get, she would get 70 of them correct, maybe 71 or 72 or 69 or something like that, but it would be really close, right? So again, the bigger my sample size is, the better measure I get of the whole, right? But sometimes I can't do a huge sample size, right? So if we want to know in Canada how many people want to defund the police, there's 36 million people. It doesn't really make sense to ask 2 people, right? There's no way that represents all of Canada. But again, we can't ask 36 million people either. And so most polls like this will ask 1,000 people or 2,000 people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's usually big enough to get some kind of idea what Canadians are thinking, okay? So that's sample size. The smaller your sample size is, the more inaccurate it is, okay? The bigger it is, the more it represents what's actually going on, okay? And so same thing with exam marks. The more questions I ask you, the better measure it is of what you actually know, okay? Whew, okay, do you want to take a little break? Because I think I do. So take a quick break, come back, and then we'll talk a little more about some other statistical things, but I think we're on the right track here, okay? So go stretch your legs, and I'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Okay, good people. Um, so we were talking about we were talking about statistics, and we were talking about sample size, right? And so the idea is that if your sample size is too small, it doesn't really tell you about the larger group. And so again, the sorry about the fish thing. Maybe the fish wasn't the best example. Maybe the exam thing is better. But again, the more questions I ask you on an exam, the better idea I get of what you actually know. And it might be tempting to just want one question on your exam. And those of you who said one, you're brave gamblers. So I'll give you respect for that. But there's a very real possibility that it will come up as 0 or it will come up as 100, and neither of those is really reflective of what you know. So I need to ask you more questions to get a better idea. Okay, and so in any kind of statistics, you need enough data points to actually represent the whole. So um, hopefully that makes some kind of sense. I'm going to skip that because maybe it doesn't. It's not as good. Okay. Here's what I want to talk about next, and this is a little bit more important. Okay, this is more important for us. Over and under representation. Okay, so in order to understand a lot of the data that we'll see in terms of inequality, it's comparing whether certain groups of people are over or underrepresented in the data. Okay, so let me ask you this question here. So our class is we roughly have a gender ratio of 50-50. And so again, if there are those of you out there who do not identify as sort of one gender or the other, I apologize, and I don't really know that, and you don't need to tell me if you don't want to, but I'm just trying to create an example here. So if we have roughly 50% guys in this class and we have 50% girls in this class, if 4 people get A's, how many guys should get A's and how many girls should get A's? What do you think? What do you think? 4 A's in this class at the end. How many guys versus how many girls should get A's? This will be interesting. Okay, interesting. So Baha says one guy and 3 girls. Baha, I'm curious why you said that. Maybe you can let me know. So Casey says 2 each. So 2 guys get A's, 2 girls get A's. Other thoughts? Okay, all quiet. So I'm going to assume that most people are thinking this. And again, you probably should be, because all things being equal, if you have, there's Karen, yeah. And Baha says because it's rarely we study and get an A. If another student gets an A, then he cheated. Okay, interesting. Okay, that's a whole other thing, though. That's a whole other thing. But most people would say that all other things being equal, 2 guys and 2 girls should get A's, right? If we have 50% girls, 50% guys in a class, 4 A's, in theory you should have 2 of each, right? That's kind of the thing you might expect. Now, if we do have a situation like Baha suggested here, where we do have one guy and three girls that score A's, then girls are actually overrepresented in that group, right? In theory, they should only be 50% of the A's, but they're actually 75% of the A's in the class. And so girls are overrepresented and guys are actually underrepresented, right? Now, if that was the case, okay, so if there were 4 A's in this class, and even though we have a gender ratio of 50-50, we found out that 3 girls and 1 guy got A's, should we be worried about this? Do we need, are guys disadvantaged? Are they falling behind? Is something wrong in our class if we wind up with 3 girls getting A's and just one guy getting an A rather than 2 and 2? What do you think? Is something wrong? Should we be concerned? Have I done something wrong? Am I biased? Am I prejudiced against guys? Is that just how numbers go? What's happening here? Should I be concerned? Okay, so Baha says no. But also tell me why, okay? Why should I or should I not be concerned? It's 3 girls, 1 guy. Well, that's true. Yes, if guys study, then they will get the mark, right? But the idea here is we're looking at the data, and we're looking at the fact that girls seem to be overrepresented here. And again, should we be concerned? Is this a problem? Maybe they are, right? The data, when you first look at it, that's definitely what the data suggests, right? Now, whether that's true or not is harder to determine, but should I be worried about this? Should we be worried about this? I don't know, Karen. Test marks don't lie, or do they? Well, let me go to my next slide here. So we probably shouldn't worry too much about this. Guys being supportive of it. Thank you. We probably shouldn't worry too much about this because, again, this is a very small sample, right? There's only 4 A's in a class of 19. And so it's not really that likely that we're going to have perfect equality in A grades, right? So we only have 4 A's. The odds of it being perfectly 2 and 2 are not that great, right? And so we could have 3 guys getting A's. We could have 3 girls getting A's. It could be 2 and 2. It could be all girls or all guys, right? And so because we have such a small sample size, again, it doesn't really reflect the pattern of a larger group. And so in a small class, we probably shouldn't be worried about that. But let's say we looked at the college as a whole. And so again, let's pretend we have 2,400 students, because we kind of do. And let's pretend the gender ratio is 50-50. I don't really know if it is, but let's pretend. Now, again, we might expect that the number of A students would also be 50-50. And so we would have an equal number of guys and an equal number of girls getting getting A grades. But in this case, if we saw 75% of A students were girls, then we might have to ask some questions, right? Because this is a much larger pattern, right? If you have a really small group and only 4 A's, really anything could happen, right? But if we're talking about 2,400 students in all their courses, and we see that girls are getting A's 75% of the time and guys are only getting A's 25% of the time, maybe something's going on there, right? Maybe we might want to ask why girls are so overrepresented in A's. Are they just studying harder? Are they smarter? Are there other factors that are playing in? It's hard to know, but the fact that girls are so overrepresented in A's, that might be worth looking into, right? And again, I'm not saying there's a problem there, but the fact that we have a large enough pool of data and we have that pattern showing up, that might cause us to look at this, right? Now, the last thing I will talk about here really quickly is when we're looking at statistics, try to pay attention to what the numbers are actually saying, okay? So polls are really good for figuring out public opinion and how people are thinking about things, but of course they don't actually tell us what things are true, right? And so here, if 70% of people believe in ghosts, that doesn't really show us that ghosts exist. It just tells us that people believe in them, right? And so people, whether people believe something is true or not is not the same as it being true. And so we should watch what our statistics are actually telling us, okay? And again, we need to look at our numbers in context, and we have to look at numbers in context as well. So have a look at this. So in Canada in 2016, about 600 people were murdered, which is awful. And it sounds like a lot, and it is. But there's 35 million people in Canada, and so the murder rate is only 1.68 per 100,000 people. But if you look in the United States, again, they have 17,000 people murdered in a population of 323 million people. So is that bad or good? Is that a lot or not a lot? And so here what we need to do is make sure the numbers are comparable. And so what they've done is they've divided it per 100,000 people so that you can actually compare the number of murders in Canada and the number of murders in the US. And so now you can pretty clearly see that, if you don't want to be murdered, Canada is a much better place to be than the United States, right? And so what we had to do is we had to make these numbers comparable, right? We had to make them out of 100,000 so that we could actually see what the pattern in the data was. If you just looked at the numbers, if you just looked at 635 million, and if you just looked at 17,323 million, it would be very difficult to figure out which country seems more dangerous, right? The numbers are too big and there's no way to compare them. And so here, if we use the same denominator here, if we use 100,000, and I'm sorry to throw math at you this early in the morning, if we use the same denominator, we can actually compare them, right? And we can see that Canada is, you're much less likely to be murdered in Canada than in other places. The other thing that we should keep an eye on when we're looking at data is we should pay attention to any assumptions we might be making about the data itself, right? So Baha said, sorry Baha, I'm not picking on you here, but you said, well, if guys study, then they will get the mark. Well, maybe, right? Unless there is something that is keeping them from getting those A grades, unless there's some other obstacle in the way. And so we might assume that if guys study hard, they'll get an A, but that might be true, but it also might not be true, right? Here's another assumption. Manish says maybe girls are just smarter. It's true, maybe they are. Or maybe something else is in the way, right? Maybe something else is keeping guys from scoring an A that we don't know about, right? So again, we have to, yeah, what are these guys doing? Um, when we look at a number, when we look at statistics, we have to be aware of our temptation to very quickly explain what's going on, right? And so again, we might look at 75% of the A's going to girls, and we might think, oh well, I guess girls are just smarter, right? And that might be true, but it also might be very untrue, right? Girls are always more busy than guys, maybe, but maybe not, right? So we have to make sure that when we see numbers, when we see data like this, that we don't explain it too quickly, right? We want to use our critical thinking skills, right? We don't want to jump to any conclusions. We want to examine why the numbers are the way they are, right? Because the statistics show us patterns, but they don't explain them. And so again, if all of the A's in the college, if 75% of those A's go to girls, that's all we know from the numbers, right? We know what is happening, but we don't know why. And so we don't know if guys aren't studying. We don't know if girls are smarter. We don't know if guys are, who knows what they're doing. We don't know if the test marks are not lying, right? Because the test mark is only as good as the test. If it's a bad test, then it gives a bad mark. Are guys just busier? Well, we don't know, right? So keep in mind that the statistic only tells you the pattern, right? It only says what the numbers are. It doesn't explain why the numbers are the way that they are. And that's kind of our job to figure out, right? So again, even though the murder rate in the US is significantly higher than in Canada, which it is, right? It's 1.68 per 100,000 in Canada and 5.3 per 100,000 in the US. So there are clearly more murders per capita in the US than Canada, but those numbers don't tell us why, right? Are gun laws to blame? Are looser gun laws to blame? Is the US just a more violent society? Do they have a different legal definition of murder? So are people being tried and convicted of murder more often in the States than in Canada? Are they just better at reporting them? And that last thing has to do with some COVID statistics as well, right? Some countries are better at recording and reporting their COVID cases than others, and so that can push the data one way or the other. So we have to think about all those things when we see numbers and not sort of jump to conclusions about what they might mean. Okay, so when we're looking at stats, when we're looking at data, we want to think about the sample size, how many people are involved in this study or set of numbers. We want to look at who's over and underrepresented, and we want to think about what does this data actually say. We don't want to jump to any conclusions about what the numbers mean, even though we might be very tempted to do that. Okay, so let's look at a couple here. Okay, now one of the ways that we can measure health in certain countries is by life expectancy, right? So most countries have pretty solid data on the average length of time that people in their country live. And so for the US, the average is 79.3 years. And so if you're an American, you can expect to live an average of about 79 years. But there are some differences, right? So if you look at the numbers below, that's broken out by gender and it's broken out by race, you can see that men do not live as long as women, right? For both women live 81 and 78 years, and men only live 76 and 72 years. So men statistically do not live as long as women. Why is that? It's a good question to ask, but the data doesn't tell us why. obviously for what we're talking about here is look at the difference between white people and black people. White people live fairly significantly longer than black people do. What does that tell us? Well, on the surface, nothing, right? But how long you live has a lot to do with your health, right? Your ability to access healthcare, your ability to access good nutritious food. It has to do with the amount of stress in your life. And so those are things that we might want to look into, but we can see a pretty clear difference. There's a pretty clear difference here between how long people live based on their race, right? The gender thing is actually something you'll see in pretty much all countries. Girls, statistically speaking, you are going to live longer than us guys. Guys, I'm sorry about that, but that just seems to be the pattern. It just seems to be what happens. But there's a real difference in how long people live in the US based on their race, right? And should that be, right? Should there be a pattern according to race? Well, there's some questions to be asked there, right? Have a look at this one here. We've talked about this a little bit, but this is median household income. So how much households are actually earning on average. So the US average is about $53,000 a year. That's what the average household earns. But look at the numbers here that are broken down according to race. So white households are above average. Asian households are way above average. So congratulations to Asian Americans. Both of those groups are significantly higher than the average, but Black and Hispanic households are significantly lower, and Black households in particular are almost half of what white households are. Again, what does that tell us, right? Why do we have such clear differences between races of people, right? In terms of what they make. Let's look at poverty rate. So the percent of the population that lives below the poverty line. And so poverty is tricky because depending on where you are in the world and depending on which country you're in, everybody measures poverty a little bit differently. The easiest way to kind of think about it here is that you do not earn enough money to pay for your most basic needs. So you cannot sort of shelter yourself, so you can't afford any to rent any place or to sort of keep a roof over your head. You can't afford food and you can't afford clothing. So you can't really afford the very basics of what you need to live. Again, the dollar figure kind of depends on the country you live in, but that's basically what it means. So this is a little shocking. I think this is a little shocking for a G7 country, but in the US, they have almost 15% of their population lives in poverty. 15% of Americans cannot afford the very basic things that they need to live: shelter and food and clothing. And that's 46 million people. But if you break that down according to race, you'll see that white people, for instance, only 10% of white people live in poverty, whereas almost 2.5 times that for black people live in poverty. So you can already see a picture developing here, even from these three statistics, right? If you are black in America, you can probably expect not to live as long as average. If you are black in America, you will probably not make as much money as other racial groups in America. If you are black in America, you are more likely to live below the poverty line than other races, right? Have a look at criminal justice here. So in the US, we can look at incarceration rates. And so incarceration is the percent of the population that is in prison. And you'll see here that for white men, and this is where representation comes in, white men are 64% of the population, but they're only 39% of the population in prison. Okay? So they are underrepresented. There are actually more white men in society than there are white men in prison. Okay? So white men are underrepresented in prison. But if you look at Hispanic, and particularly if you look at black men are only 13% of the population in the US. They're actually kind of a minority. But in prison, they're actually 40% of the prison population. So black men are very overrepresented in prison. There are really far more of them there than you would expect based on how many are actually in society as a whole. Okay? Oh, hang on. So before we go to that, does that make some sort of sense? Okay, we've seen a few statistics in which we can see pretty clear differences between we've seen racial disparities, right? Racial differences between life expectancy, so how healthy you are, how long you can expect to live, how much money you have, your chance of living in poverty, and we've seen a little bit of the representation of the jail system. And so for black men, even though black people represent only 13% of the population in the US, which is quite small actually, in prison they are 40% of the prison population. They are very overrepresented in there. And again, that should lead us to question, why is that, right? Why are we seeing these differences? Because it's just like the A's in class, right? All other things being equal, we should expect guys and girls to get A's equally, right? We should have an equal number of guys and girls getting A's if everything else is equal. And so it's the same thing in the prison system. If all other things are equal, if black people are 13% of the US population, in theory, they should be 13% of the prison population as well. But that's not the case, right? In fact, they are much more likely to be in prison than other races and ethnicities. And so, again, the question is, why, right? Why are we seeing this pattern? And again, why are we seeing, through all these different measures, why are we seeing black people disadvantaged so often? Why are they so often at the bottom, right? Why are they making less money? Why are they living less long? Why are they winding up in prison, right? We're seeing lots of different measures, lots of different data, and they seem to be implying the same story, that something is wrong, right? That for some reason, outcomes for black Americans is not as good as for other people, right? And again, we should ask the question, why? What is going on? Okay, how are we with that so far? Does that make sense? Do you understand what we're talking about? Do you have questions? Do you have things you want to say? Are there things that were confusing? Do you want me to clarify anything? Do you just want to say something because you want to say it? Give me something here. I know there are 16 of you out there, so wow, everything is perfecto. Okay, so Manish is good. KC is good. Karen's okay. Mashid is good. Okay. One of the things that's really important to take from this is that idea of over and under representation. Okay, so again, if you have 13% of the population that is black, if everything was equal, we would see that reflected in other places as well, right? We would see that 13% of the prison population was black. We would also see that 13% of people who graduate from university are black, right? We would see that through society if all things were equal, right? We would see that that same kind of pie chart of different races in the US. We would see it reflected through all parts of society. But the thing is that we don't see that, right? In fact, when we're talking about negative things, when we're talking about living below the poverty line, when we're talking about lower net worth, when we're talking about poor health, when we're talking about the winding up in prison, we see that it's not 13% of black people we're seeing a bigger piece of the pie. And again, that should lead us to wonder, why is that, right? Why are we seeing what we're seeing? Okay, so the last thing I'll ask you to do here, and this will be for tomorrow, so it shouldn't take long, it should only take you about 5 minutes or so to do, is I would like you to just have a look on the internet and see if you can find one piece of data that also seems to suggest that systemic racism exists, okay? And so I want you to just type it out really quickly and then save it for tomorrow, because I want you to put it into the live chat when we start talking about this tomorrow, okay? So find one piece of data that might suggest that we have a problem with systemic racism, okay? So some way in which one racial group is disadvantaged as compared to others, okay? Does that sound doable? Does that sound okay? Okay, so Karen says it sounds good. All right. KC's good. Okay. Sheet is good. Okay, Ivan's good. Do we send it? Hang on to it until tomorrow, Baha, and then we'll put them into this live stream, and we'll look at them kind of one at a time and see what we see, okay? Okay, Jenna's good. Okay, so I will leave it there. I'll let you find that piece of data. Just do a quick internet search. It shouldn't take, it should only take just a few minutes to do. So don't spend an hour on it or anything. All right. So that's what I'll ask you to do. Find a piece of data somewhere on the internet that you think suggests a problem with systemic racism. We'll put them into the live chat tomorrow. We'll talk about them and see what we see, and then I have some other stuff for you. So until then, I think we'll leave it there for today. As always, if you have questions, you can always message me. That's no problem. But find your piece of data. We'll talk about those pieces of data tomorrow. And I think that's all I have. So I'll let you go. Some of you I'll see in comparative cultures in 20 minutes or so. And some of you I'll see tomorrow. Okay, so bye.